Hi everyone. So this is the video lecture for early hominin genera. So hopefully, before we start that, hopefully you saw the video announcement I posted earlier this morning. It was really quick. It was like a minute long, just going over some of the details of the exam. If you haven't had a chance, go ahead and watch that. But it's really not any major new information that I'd already told you, just a quick recap. What I forgot to put in the announcement, so I'll just tell you now, is that, and obviously you've probably figured this out by now, is that I'm not doing any kind of live streaming lecture. So basically we heard from the schools and they're preferring that we don't do that for a few reasons, which is totally fine. I've been doing the recorded ones and these seem to be working fine. I've checked and it's obvious that the majority of the students are watching them. All the videos so far have multiple views. So I'm assuming it's you guys and not just like random people from the internet. I don't know why they would want to watch these lectures. So that's good news that you guys are watching them and using them, and hopefully you continue to do that. You'll notice that they're clearly shorter than a normal class period because there's not, I don't have you guys to kind of discuss anything or ask questions, so it's just me talking. So of course the lectures are a bit shorter, which is fine. It's probably better for you guys. You know, you can just sit and watch them, and you know, you spend less time doing that than you normally would have come to class. So hopefully it's a little more convenient for everybody involved. I don't think there's any other pre-lecture announcement that I can think of. So I guess we'll just kind of go right into this PowerPoint. Oh, one other thing. So I did notice that at least one student has started a discussion in the discussion part in Canvas, which is great. Remember, those are not required. You're not going to get points for them, but they are there for your convenience. They're there for you to use if you need them, if you need to ask me questions, if you need to ask another student question or comment. But like I said before, they're not required, but hopefully if you have any questions for me or just a general comment about something, you feel free to post it there. That's only going to be helpful for all of us. So I guess we'll just get started on this PowerPoint. So I'll just do it like I did before. I have my PowerPoint like off screen. You can't see it. I went back and forth whether I wanted to have just the PowerPoint and you hear my voice. That doesn't seem very interactive. I feel like that would be more boring for you. So hopefully you just seeing my face and my apartment and probably my dogs at some point too is a little more interactive and keeps you guys interested. But obviously you have to have, you know, this video split with the PowerPoint. But just like before, the PowerPoint will be up on Canvas today, so you can go through it as you're watching this video. So for right now, we'll start the early hominin genera PowerPoint. So the first slide is obviously the title slide. Second, I don't know if it's gonna work. Okay, so slide number 2. So this is kind of a shorter PowerPoint, which is nice. I mean, I'm assuming you guys probably think it's nice. It's kind of short, but okay. So slide number 2, hominins. So on this slide, you'll see that there's a picture. So the Smithsonian did some recreations based on fossils and some other evidence. They did like recreations of many of these species that we're going to be talking about for the next week or so. Most of them are probably fairly accurate. And as you see, we go through this PowerPoint to the next few PowerPoints, you'll see these recreations that the Smithsonian did. And there's probably a little artistic license with some of it, but I would say the majority of it's fairly accurate with what they're doing with the morphology. So it's kind of interesting to see, instead of just looking at a bone or seeing a picture, you know, of a skeleton, that you actually have this more lifelike image, which is, you know, I think puts a lot of it into perspective when we're talking about, you know, our past and the ancestors in our past. So on slide 2, you'll see this picture of these many different hominins. So remember that a hominin is anything in our lineage, the human lineage, since our split with chimpanzees approximately 6 million years ago. So we're beginning this conversation now, talking about those individual species. Now, your book might list a bunch of species. But for this class, we're only going to talk about a select few. Know that there are probably more, but also understand that there was still debate in our field of paleoanthropology about what constitutes a new species, how many of these are actually separate species, you know, how much of this is just variation within a species. So we'll get to some of those debates as we go through these next couple of weeks. But just understand that the point was that the book might list a few more than what I'm actually going to talk about in the PowerPoint. But remember that for the exam, I'm never going to ask you something from the book that I don't talk about or mention in some way in the PowerPoint. So be aware of that. Okay, so you'll see on this first slide, or on slide 2, that the old name was hominid. And I think I mentioned this in the last slide when we're talking about bipedalism, that remember that with naming and classifying and the way science works, that when we get new information, you know, we may have to reorganize how we understand evolutionary relationships. And then that may mean that we end up changing slightly how things are named. And so this is what this means. So if you're looking at an older book or an older article, or you're talking to even an older professor who was trained using this terminology, they'll use the term hominid. We use the term hominin with an N now. Same thing. However, there is a little confusion because hominid now actually has a slightly different meaning. Don't worry about that. But anyway, same thing. And then, like this last bullet point says, that this is everything in our lineage since our split with chimpanzees. So recall from a previous lecture that we had talked about anagenesis versus cladogenesis, that sometimes, you know, we see one species kind of evolving into another slowly over time. Sometimes we see a branching events, you know, lineages splitting off from each other. So even within our lineage, in the last 6 million years since our split with chimps, you know, we have a common ancestor. Chimps, you know, went into their evolutionary trajectory. We went on ours. There's still some branching events even in our lineage. So not every species that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of lectures is our direct ancestor, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. There will be some pictures and stuff. But it's all still in our general lineage since our split. And they're all considered hominins. Okay, so moving on. So the next slide. Why is that not working? No, okay. Slide number 3. So you'll see this picture of kind of what I just described. So we have, you know, you'll see this taxonomic tree that is showing, you know, there's a time scale on the side, 6 million years ago, to like present. And you'll see that there was an initial split, there's some branching events. At certain points, you know, around 2 million years ago, many of these species are existing around the same time. So this is really weird for us because right now we are the only hominin that's currently existing. There's no other hominin that's existing now. It's just humans. But for the majority of this evolutionary process, there were more than just one. Sometimes even, you know, maybe 3 or 4 living in around the same area at around the same time. But like I said, that's very different from how it is now. So it's kind of an interesting and different concept, like to imagine that there would be multiple hominin species. But so it's only recently that there's just us. For the majority of the last 6 million years, there's been more than one. But you can also see in that chart that there are some dashed lines where we're not quite sure, like, okay, did this species come from this one? Maybe we're pretty sure. The evidence is pointing towards it. So just understand, like we talked about this in science. Science is always learning. We're always growing. We're waiting for new evidence. You know, we have new research coming out every month, you know, with telling us a little more about this DNA or this genetic information or this, you know, morphological information, or a new species is found. So we find new stuff all the time that totally rewrites what we thought. We thought we knew everything. We thought, okay, we have like 95% of it. And then we find a new fossil and we're like, whoa, this really changes this whole other part that we didn't know, or now it fills in this gap. So just understand that while we could probably confidently say we know the majority of the story, the evolutionary story that's happened in the last 6 million years, we don't know everything, and we know that. And there's always the possibility that we find new stuff that clarifies other information or surprises us in some way. So we'll talk about that when we get into like the later hominins that we, even as recent as like, you know, 2015 and like I think 2006, we had some major discoveries that totally, you know, surprised us with what we thought was going on in our lineage. So be aware that happens. So on this slide, on slide 3 still, you'll see basically what I just said, that we're finding new things. we think we know, and then we realize like, we find new things, and it changes how we thought about things before. And so this is really important in science. And then the last point you'll see is something where it says lumper versus splitter. So this is this idea that for any new fossil that's found, when you are the scientist who finds it, it'd be nice if it were a new species and you can name it something, interesting, and but not every fossil that's found is going to be something new. It could easily just be another species that we already know about. And remember that species, we aren't born with a label. Like, the idea of even categorizing different groups into what we call a species can be problematic. It has bias. We're trying to kind of put nature in different boxes. It doesn't quite fit that way. Like, the majority of the time it does, and we can kind of understand it that way. And it's good to understand it that way. But it's not a perfect system. And also, you have to take into account natural variation. So this is what I was saying before. Where's the line between, okay, we're seeing a lot of variation in the species, which happens, absolutely, versus, okay, now it's more than just variation. I think we're seeing two different species. So understand, like, this is the idea of lumper versus splitter. Lumpers will say, look, it's just variation. This is probably just one species. Splitters really will be like, no, new species, new species, new species. So just understand that most paleoanthropologists kind of fall into one of those. They're a little more liberal or conservative with how they understand the categorization and the process of classifying. Okay, so next slide number 4. So recall those species concepts that we talked about before: the biological species concept, the ecological species concept, the recognition species concept, and those are only 3. Remember that I told you there are so many. Many people have ideas about how we should classify species. The biological species concept works most of the time. It's the one most people kind of think of conceptually when they think of, like, what is a species? They think of that like it's a group that can't interbreed with another group. But then recall, we talked about this in class, that there are exceptions to that rule, as there are with anything in nature. There are always going to be exceptions. We talked about that too. But just kind of keep that in mind, that the idea of a species is not 100% infallible. Like, we still have some interesting ideas about how it works, and which concept are you using, how do you define it? But then even if we're getting into those larger groups, like, how do we define a genus? Like, what's a genus? So this is what this slide is getting at. So for a genus, usually we say, okay, there are multiple species. They're clearly different morphologically, but they still belong to the same genus. Now, what is a genus? So a genus is a group that what we call has an adaptive niche. So while at the species level, they might be very different because they can't interbreed. Maybe their morphology is quite different, but sharing a genus, they have something that's adaptive that they have in common. So as we get into the different genera, so genera is plural for genus. As we get into the different genera, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about with these different adaptive niches. And then I just reiterated what I'd said before on this PowerPoint, or this slide, that individuals aren't born with labels. Like, we are putting labels on them, but remember that that's not really how nature works, and so we have to recognize that that's our bias. It's an important endeavor to be able to try to understand and categorize and understand these evolutionary relationships, absolutely. But remember that it's not always clear cut. But we do love to organize. Humans are really good at that. Okay, so the next slide number 5. So recall that we talked before about this in the primate stuff about cladistics versus evolutionary taxonomy, that, neither one's right or wrong. It's just different ways of kind of looking at evolutionary relationships, looking at those features that we see, our ancestral features, what we should be focusing on, are derived or new features, what we should be focusing on. How does that shift how we understand the evolutionary relationships? How does that shift how we understand, like, the time scale, whether time is even important, whether it's just the relationships that are important? Like, so neither one's right or wrong. They're just kind of slightly different ways of looking at it. So this is going to be important when we start talking about the genus Homo later on. And I know I mentioned this before, but just understand that there are quite a few things in paleo that are still, like, debated. And so if you're reading the textbook, it's like, it seems as if it's like, oh, this is clear cut, the whole field agrees on this, this is what's in the textbook. But understand that fields are a little more fluid to that, and people disagree. And while we might have a consensus about certain things, and that's why it's in the textbook, understand, like, one, that there's still debate, and two, if we find new information, that might change. So keep that in mind. Next slide. Slide number 6. So you'll see this picture of Africa with all the different countries highlighted, and just one bullet point, all early genera are in Africa. So when we're talking about these early genera, up until fairly recently, most of the hominin lineage, and especially all the early genera, are in Africa. So we're talking just about Africa. Sometimes we'll be talking about South Africa or East Africa, but it's all still taking place in Africa. We don't see hominins leaving Africa until much later. So conceptually understand, as we talk about these early species, that this is all taking place in Africa. Next slide. Oops, I skipped one. Slide number 7. So we're going to talk about these specific genera and species now. So you'll see this nice little picture I created in Paint, where it's showing, that last common ancestor, chimpanzees in this lineage. Eventually we get to humans in this lineage along this line. And we're talking about those early ones. So just like, for me, I like to have a visual of the timeline, because it's like, I don't know, it's just the way I learn. So I assume that most of you like that visual as well. So just know we're talking about those early ones, kind of right around that split with chimps, and right after. And the further back in time we go, the less evidence we have. It all depends on how things are preserving, what the environment was like, did things preserve well or not. So we have a lot of evidence for stuff that happened more recently, a lot of really great evidence. But the stuff that happened earlier on, remember, this is 6 million years ago. We have some stuff, we have some really good stuff, but we don't have as much. And so there's still a lot of questions about what happened, like right around that split and like right after. So just understand that we're still learning a lot. It'd be great if we can, get some more evidence of that. So we're going to talk about these 3 genera, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and Ardipithecus. So if we go to the next slide, that is slide number 8, you'll see a picture of the type specimen of Sahelanthropus chadensis. So a type specimen is typically it's the very first fossil that's found for that species. We call it the type specimen. Usually any other fossil that's found is compared to that type specimen, type of that species. So we use any other one to compare it to that, to see if it's, it fits into that species. So here we have this really very interesting looking, very unique looking fossil. So if you're looking at that, and per the one bullet point I have, what do you notice? So this would be in class, I'd ask you, what do you notice? And people would, interject. So as you're watching this video now, you're probably looking at this picture and noticing some really interesting things. So I'll just point out usually what students end up saying. So one is that you notice that they have this very massive brow ridge. So we talked very briefly about that for the primates, that they have this very pronounced brow ridge. Humans, we don't really have that at all. Even when I was talking about the previous lecture on male versus female humans, males tend to have a little bit of a bump, females fairly flat, but we don't have this massive bony structure for modern humans. But we see that in our ancestors. We see that in many primate species. Sorry guys, I have to like blow my nose. Yeah, not. Okay, sorry about that. So you're probably noticing this big brow ridge. That's a good one. You're also probably noticing that the brain, or what you can see, the head, the cranium, is fairly small. Like if you imagine, like compared to like a modern human, we have very big brains. So that's quite different. And while not all the teeth are there, you notice that some of the teeth are that they're fairly moderate to large-ish in size, at least compared to the rest of the face. So even with just this one specimen, you're probably noticing those few things, so that's important. So these are accurate. So even earlier on in our lineage, that it's not as if suddenly there was this fully bipedal, big-brained, small-toothed hominin. That's not how it works. So recall that we talked about this idea called mosaic evolution, that when you're looking at a group, whether it's like hominins, And you have, or even primates when we talked about primates, if you have a group or a characteristic or a suite of traits and you say, okay, this group of traits, 6 traits or 7 traits or whatever it is, kind of characterizes this group of hominins or primates. Remember that the idea of mosaic evolution is that those traits, while they might categorize that group, didn't all happen at the same time and they didn't happen at the same rate. So while we can say for hominins that, when we talked about this in the previous lecture, that, why am I blanking? Bipedalism, big brains, less prognathism, like those 6 traits we talked about, while we could say those traits categorize hominins, they didn't all happen at the same time and they didn't happen at the same rate. So those first few hominins that we're seeing, we might see biped, definitely, but the brains might still be fairly small. So just recall it, like think about that as we're talking about these species in terms of like the time that you'll see some of these traits happening very quickly in the beginning and some traits kind of happening over time. Okay, so the next slide number 9, is so more on Sahelanthropus tchadensis. So there's just some general information about the time, so 6 to 7 million years ago in Chad and Central Africa, and you'll see that on the picture where that's located. So I'm never going to ask you. This would have been true for in class. This is true for the essay. I'm never going to ask you to recite a date. That's not important to me. You might have to know in general like which species was first, like you might have to know like a relative timeline. That's kind of important to understand, but I'm never going to ask you like to memorize dates. That's not really important, but this is just for clarification for your own, you like to kind of put it all in perspective what's happening. But there are some important features about this this individual. So thin enamel on the teeth, interesting. We talked about thick enamel is a characteristic of hominin, so doesn't have that yet. And the teeth are still kind of like large, or they're medium moderate size. So our common ancestor probably had the same teeth. It's not as if teeth within a few thousand years are suddenly going to become very, very small. But we're pretty sure that this individual was bipedal. You'll see here on the PowerPoint, I have bipedal question marks. So the skeletal evidence we have, which is limited, seems to be pointing clearly to bipedalism. However, it's always important to have more information, more evidence to reaffirm that. So that's why there's kind of the question mark. Like, we're pretty sure, it seems as if that's what evidence is showing, but the more evidence we have, we can confirm that. So just understand that that's a question mark. And you'll see this little drawing I made where it says, chimps, humans, last common ancestor, and Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Understand this is kind of a debate that some would say Sahelanthropus tchadensis is the first hominin in our lineage, and some would say it actually might be the last common ancestor with chimps. So is it that last common ancestor that we have with chimpanzees, or is it after that last common ancestor and it's the first in our lineage? So just understand this is kind of a debate. Like I said before, when you go back farther in time, we have, and depending on how things preserved, what the environment was where they preserved, we have less information. So as we get more fossil information, hopefully this becomes more clear. But understand that some people would consider it not necessarily the first hominin in our lineage, but actually the last common ancestor. So interesting idea. Okay, the next slide, slide 10. Auroran tugenensis, 6 million years ago in Kenya. So you'll see that on the picture as well, where that's located. So these last few have all been like in Central Eastern Africa. And this is still earlier on, so 6 million years ago. So right after that split with chimpanzees, canine size is still fairly moderate, but clearly bipedal at this point, thick enamel. So this is important. We're seeing those traits. And you can see the picture of some of the type fossils that we have, where it's clearly indicating based on those bones that this individual was bipedal at this point. And this is probably the more important hallmark of hominins for sure. So even while we say, okay, these 6 traits characterize hominins, bipedalism, big brains, thick enamel, no CP3 hominin complex, less prognathism, bipedalism is the one we look for because that's the one we know pretty much happened right away. That's really one of the distinguishing features of what we see in that trajectory after the last common ancestor with chimpanzees is that they remained quadrupedal and we became bipedal. Other stuff happened later, like brains got bigger, teeth got smaller, like all that stuff definitely characterizes us as a group. But bipedalism, pretty much we know, is that defining feature in the beginning. So we definitely look for that, and it's really important. So we know at this point that Auroran, while the teeth might be still kind of medium size, they are bipedal, clearly in our lineage. Okay, next slide. Slide 11. Ardipithecus ramidus. So now we're looking at, okay, that should say 5.8, not 58 million years ago. Sorry, guys. So 5.8 to 4.4. Now we're in Ethiopia, so we're still in Eastern Africa. So remember, this is where I was when I traveled. I know I mentioned that to you guys at the beginning of the semester, that I had just recently come back from a trip to Ethiopia, which is a very interesting, cool experience. So that's where these specimens were found. So we have quite a few from a few different sites. And so enamel's thin here. That's weird and interesting. But they're bipedal. So while some people would say, oh no, it's definitely in our lineage, we're just seeing this weird kind of mixture of traits, it's all kind of getting fleshed out at the beginning. Some people would say maybe this actually isn't a species in our lineage at all. Maybe, because we're seeing like this thin enamel, like we had thin enamel in the beginning, okay, then thick enamel, then thin enamel again. That doesn't really quite make sense. Maybe this isn't even a species in our lineage. Maybe this was a third split. There was chimps, humans, and then, Ardipithecus, maybe. And this happens in nature. We see not just maybe a branching event of two, but maybe a third. So like I said, but there's there's probably more questions than answers for a lot of these early genera. Even if we said, okay, we're gonna just assume they're all in our lineage, we're still seeing some interesting features. They're all bipedal, and that's important, but we're seeing thin enamel, thick enamel. It's understand, like I said before, that we need more information about this early stuff. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then the last slide for this PowerPoint, just a little bit more about this area in Ethiopia. That a lot of fossils we find in this area, in the Afar, and in fact, my advisor has been recently in this area looking for fossils, so we'll see if he found anything recently. He found something not that long ago, a couple years ago. But so there's a lot of tectonic activity, things preserved really well in this area. They find so much stuff in this area. In fact, when I was in Ethiopia, I got to tour the museum there, the National Museum, and they have a lot of hominin stuff, but they have so much primate stuff, other larger mammals like fossil elephants, and it's a massive collection. So much amazing fossil evidence of nature in general. So very cool. Okay, so that's the end of this PowerPoint for early hominin genera. I know not a lot of great information. A lot of it's, like I said, a lot of it's still we're have more questions than answers. But we're pretty sure we know, like the majority of the story, these earlier species, genera, were bipedal. But like I said, as we get more fossil evidence, we're going to be able to fill in those gaps in that information. Definitely the stuff we have, the species that came later, we have so much more fossil evidence. The story's much more clear at that point. So that's it for this one, and I will post the PowerPoint for this, and I will also post a discussion board, and I hope to hear from you guys soon. Hope to keep seeing the views on these videos, that you guys are clearly watching them and using them. And just like before, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email me, and I will hear from you guys soon and talk to you guys soon. Bye.